Hello, fifth graders, and welcome back to another The Math Show with Miss Condry. We are going to be discussing one of the pages in your packet for the week that has you working through some different story problems. There's 3 different story problems, and so I'm just going to talk through one that's kind of similar to one of the problems you'll be working on, and it will be review because all 3 of these problems are review. I want to remind you really quickly about our classroom norms. Have a positive attitude, be respectful, remember to keep trying even when it gets challenging, and remember that word yet. All right, so let's get started. We are going to be learning about solving story problems involving fractions and decimals today, and hint, it's only adding and subtracting with fractions and decimals. I'm going to kind of leave the decimal one out of it for right now because the decimal one will be fairly easy. You can use a standard algorithm, and for the most part we really haven't struggled too much with adding and subtracting decimals because they're so much like money. I do want to talk a little bit through one of the fraction problems. So again, this is Unit 6, Module 1. It's found on page 204, and it looks like this. All right, so 3 different problems, and it does ask you to show your work. So I'm just going to model showing my work for a different story problem that's similar to one of the ones on here. All right, so I have a problem here. I've been doing quite a bit of baking while being in quarantine, and maybe some of you have also. So flour's on my mind a lot because I've been using a lot of flour. All right, so I had 4 1/3 cups of flour. I used 2 3/4 cups, and I want to know how much is left. Okay, so the first thing you need to do before answering these problems, because they could be a variety of operations, so you could be adding or being asked to subtract, and sometimes in other problems you might be asked to multiply or divide. So the first thing you need to do is really think about what the problem is asking. So if I started with 4 1/3 cups, and then I used up 2 3/4 cups, this is a pretty straightforward subtraction problem, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jot down what I think an expression could be, or an equation that could match what I'm being asked to do. 4 1/3 minus 2 3/4 equals some amount. Now, I'm one of those people who doesn't really like to count backwards. When I'm doing subtraction, I always like to reverse it and see if I can use addition to solve it. So I always write a fact family equation next to the subtraction one because I don't really like going backwards, and you might be similar to me. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this as 2 3/4 cups of flour that I used, plus the amount that I have left should get me to the amount that I started with. And now I can use addition instead of subtraction, and that to me is just a lot friendlier way to go. You don't have to do it that way, but that's the way I'm going to model today. Next thing you need to do is think about a model or a picture that you could use that will make sense to you. All right, so I'm going to use a number line. I really like number lines because it helps me kind of organize my thinking, and it also, I don't know, just as a nice picture in my head of what's actually happening. So that's what I'm going to use. You don't have to use a number line. You could use just bare equations, whatever makes sense to you, really. There's no right way to do this. Well, there's lots of right ways to do this. Okay, so I'm going to start with 2 3/4 cups of flour, and I'm going to try and keep adding jumps until I get up to 4 1/3 cups of flour. Okay, so this missing portion here is going to be in my jumps. And I like to use landmark numbers. Now, if you don't know what a landmark number is, you can revisit the video from last week Unit 5, Module 4, I did talk a little bit about landmark numbers for one of those pages. So landmark number here, 2 3/4, I want to get to 3 because 3 is a little easier to work with for me. So in order to get to 3, I would need to add another 1/4 cup of flour, and now I'm at 3 cups of flour. But remember, I started with 4 1/3 cups of flour. So then I'm going to add, well, if I added 1 cup of flour, that would get me to 4. And then I just need another 1/3. Now those jumps ignore, because really we know 1/3 is bigger than 1/4, but I didn't model it exactly accurately, but just know that in your head. Okay, so then I added 1/3, and now I know that the amount in my jumps is the amount of flour that I have left, because when I combine it with what I used, it gets me the amount that I started with. Okay, so now I just have to get my answer, so I have to do 1 plus 1/3 plus 1/4, and that will be my answer. The problem here is that 1/3 and 1/4 have different denominators, so I need to use that strategy of ratio tables. We've talked about that in a couple videos, once last week, and there's also one from the first couple of weeks. So if you are stuck on how to do that, make sure you go back and revisit those videos. I'm going to model it pretty quickly here because I know that 1/3 and 1/4 can both have 12 as the denominator, and since 3 times 4 was 12, 1 times 4 is 4/12. 4 times 3 is 12, so 1 times 3 is 3/12, and my answer is 1 7/12. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to the original problem and make sure it makes sense. If I were to start with 4 1/3 and remove 2 3/4 cups of flour, yeah, 1 7/12 does make sense. Okay, so your job as you're working through these problems, again, not all of them are going to be subtraction, but I want you to really make sure that you are thinking through what the problem is asking you, and then thinking about models or equations or pictures that will help you solve those problems. And make sure you save your questions for next week when we're meeting on Teams. All right, good luck.